Hey guys, so a lot has happened in the last 48 hours, as some of you probably know already. I just like to thank Steven Erickson for not only acknowledging and sharing the video that I made, but for the encouraging comments that he left behind as well. I went to sleep on Friday night having no idea that any of this was going to happen, and I freaked out when I woke up in the morning in a good way, right? In a good way. I'd like to thank all you guys who watched that video, and a special thank you to Ishka Jarak for not only being a bridge through which Steven Erickson could find me, but also for having encouraged me to start this YouTube channel in the first place. And a special thank you for my 100 plus subscribers. The fact that there are more than 100 of you willing to click on that subscribe button for me, it's insane, right? But thank you. I really do appreciate it. So with all that said, let's get this video going. I have some notes prepared this time, so hopefully this video will be more organized as it should, because we're going in pretty deep, right? If you find the Forkrul Assail interesting, or if you want to sort of get to know about them a little bit more, then buckle in, because we're going in balls deep into the Forkrul Assail, right? Metaphorically, of course. So the Forkrul Assail are probably the most terrifying of all the Malazan races, and probably the least discussed as well in many ways, which is a shame, because they are also in many ways the most complex race, if you ask me. It's understandable though, because they are the least discussed and they're shrouded in a lot of mystery until book number 10, right? So let's try to look at why the Forkrul Assail are such an important sort of instrument in the books, and why they're so important in terms of our own enjoyment of the overall Malazan Book of the Fallen series, the 10 big books. It's not just because they are the big, bad, evil force at the end. It's not just that. It's because Erickson pulls the carpet out from under us, right? As usual. Because he's given us 9 books where the crippled god has been built up as this ultimate evil, so to speak, as the final villain. And then we find out that the crippled god is the damsel in distress that we've all been on this epic journey to save. So he's not only is he not the bad guy, but we are here to save the poor man. So in one book, Erickson has to flip the entire script, so to speak, and give us a new antagonist who's also worthy of this final convergence. It sounds like an impossible task, and yet Erickson succeeds against all odds by putting the Forkrul Assail in that position. And even though fiction is full of villains who sort of want to punish humanity for their sins against nature, and so who sort of want to restart the world because they are sick of what evil humans do when they exploit the world and all that, he manages to make the Forkrul Assail stand out, even in a sort of crowded, villainous space like that. And one of the reasons this works is because he doesn't make them give us long speeches about how humans exploit the world. He just gives them a cold, hard logic and a moral clarity, where they don't really need to give us these long speeches for us to know how much they hate us. They manage to be both horror genre type monsters and moral philosophers at the same time, right? Which is pretty interesting, given that this series itself loves to play around with ideas like that. So one theme that immediately jumps out to me, and one reason I think this works so well, is the minimalist approach that Erickson takes when he kind of writes about the Forkrul Assail, both in his depiction of their culture and appearance, and how in how sparingly he uses them. He takes a very Spartan approach to things. As a race, they stand for the rejection of excess, and everything about them screams this, from their appearance to their cities to their ethics. All of this, by the way, makes them more terrifying and mysterious, and sort of the final nail in the coffin, which really makes them such a great, such a threatening force, is their moral minimalism, if that makes sense, where their morality is so complex and yet so simple. In fact, you could say that the narrative and physical minimalism I spoke about just a few seconds ago, all of that is meant to enhance the moral minimalism, the moral clarity of the Forkrul Assail. Their version of justice and balance is so alien to our own, and yet it's so clear and concise and simple. even when two Forkruls don't agree with each other, like reverence and calm in book 10. It's just such a simple and clear moral philosophy. So let's let's deconstruct their sort of all of these things one by one, right? So firstly, why do I say Erikson uses narrative minimalism when it comes to sort of writing about the Forkrul Assail? For starters, like I was saying, they're the least discussed race in the series. Even with the Tis Leosin, we get the group that sort of meets up with Trull and Onrak. We get a little bit with Lorik and his father. In the 10 big books itself, the Forkrul Assail get by far, at least until book 10, the least screen time. We get next to nothing about them, and even the little we get is just horror movie stuff, right? It's brilliant and it's terrifying. Just consider this basic formula that Erikson uses the first 3 or 4 times we see a live Forkrul Assail, right? Step one, someone runs into this creepy, lanky thing that looks like a giant, scary puppet. Step two, it introduces itself with a single word name. Step three, it says a bunch of cryptic shit that nobody understands. And step four, it attacks. It's a basic formula and it's repeated over and over again. If you go back to the encounter between Calm and Kasa all along in House of Chains, it fits this formula. I'm sure most of you remember that scene. It's the same formula in Midnight Tides when Rulard and his brothers run into Serenity, which is it's a great scene, by the way, right? So these guys enter this town that's just been destroyed and there are corpses everywhere and there are even buildings shattered with bare fists. Someone's just wrecked this entire town. And the warlock with them keeps saying, it's one creature, it knows you're here, it's coming, blah, blah, blah. And Erikson just builds up the anticipation where these guys have readied their weapons and they are waiting for this demonic presence that's destroyed this entire town to show up. And they see a flock of black birds near this abandoned market. And all the birds scatter in their direction. And as the birds part, they see this tall, spectral, creepy-looking thing walking in their direction. That scene is so brilliantly done and cinematic. It's also the formula that's used when we see the next appearance of a Forkrul Assail in Dust of Dreams, which is when sort of a Forkrul Assail confronts Yedan, and of course it gets its head chopped off. That's what happens. It's a great scene again where the Forkrul Assail sort of demands his name so that it can control him. And he just says, I am the watch, and chops its head off. So that's the narratively minimalist approach that Erikson initially takes to the race, right? Where the first 3 appearances of the race spread throughout the books all follow the same basic formula, but because it's such a brilliant and frightening formula, it scares the shit out of us every single time. Now let's look at the way Erikson makes them a physically minimalist race as well. Until book 10, they're all either described as being naked or wearing a harness. The Calm and the one in book 9 are both naked, and if I'm not mistaken, the one in Midnight Tides is supposed to be wearing a harness. The use of the word harness is again interesting because it suggests utility and not style or fashion. Their features are minimalist. They're pretty much expressionless most of the time. Their skin is unblemished with no marking. Their names are minimalist as well. They all have single word names like Calm, Grave, Reverence. They are the only race who keep away from the use of weapons, unlike everyone else, right? They are the only ones who actually fight with their physical body. All the other races, even the Jagut and things like that, use weapons. Their pit cities are the kind of very definition of architectural minimalism, where there's nothing but empty space for them to gather. I have a quote here from Silcher's Ruin, and he has some of the best quotes about them in the entire series because he's just spent so much of his time slaughtering them and thinking about why they need to be purged. So he describes the pit cities as the physical expression of the quality of absence, right? Think about that. The physical expression of the quality of absence. And this is probably one of the shortest and clearest descriptions of what true minimalism is in an architectural sense. They don't even live in these cities. They gather when they need to bring justice. And this word justice now brings us to the most important point in terms of deconstructing the Forkrul Assail, which is their moral minimalism and how this affects their understanding of justice and balance. When I mean moral minimalism, I certainly don't mean it in the sense of them placing minimal priority on morality. In fact, we all know that that's not the case at all. What I mean is that their entire moral philosophy can be described in half a line, right? Which Silchus Ruin does. And once again, I'm quoting here. He calls their philosophy the deliberate embrace of diametric opposition, right? Think about that. And that's the entire philosophy in a nutshell. There is nothing more than that. A deliberate embrace of diametric opposition, as in, these guys believe that the answer to every extreme is in enforcing the opposite extreme. Ruin even uses some analogies to make this point. So the Forkrul Assail believe that the way to achieve peace is to deliver destruction. To make someone free, you imprison them. So all of the themes around them have this thing of diametric opposites. There's a scene where Kettle looks at their tapestries and points out that their faces aren't visible. And Ruin just says, yes, that's the opposite of identity. As in, even in their own tapestries, which are meant to preserve the memory of the people being depicted, they don't make their own faces visible because that's the opposite of what a tapestry is meant to do. Like I said, it's so simple and yet so complex. So this embrace of opposites is what defines their, as I was saying, their understanding of justice and balance. And they're two words that are used with a lot of significance by the Forkrul Assail themselves. They seem to use the two words interchangeably sometimes, but what we can make of it is this. They see nature and the world as constantly striving towards balance. And therefore, they see the pursuit of balance and the maintenance of balance as the most important ideal in the world, right? But as I was saying earlier, their version of their definition of balance is a completely alien concept to what you and I would consider balance. It's the type of balance that can only be enforced through annihilation. We get an early insight into their belief in strength and destruction when Beak, poor Beak, right, recalls a story about the Just Wars, where the last survivor of the battlefield was a Forkrul Assail, and it's bleeding to death. And even as it's bleeding to death, it saw their victory on this battlefield as a vindication of their philosophy. Even as it was the last survivor moments away from dying, it kind of thought to itself that they were right because they won. Look at their war with the Errant, for example, right? The master of tiles. He wanted to be balanced as well, but he had the human understanding of balance. So he had a policy of non-interference, of neutrality, or so we are told in Reaper's Gale. But yeah, I think it was in Reaper's Gale. But to the Forkrul Assail, that was not balance. They saw it as stagnation. So they waged a war against him. They waged a war against a god. What to him and us seems like the rational definition of balance was unacceptable to them. It was stagnation to them. And they believed that he had to be destroyed because of this stagnation. As a contrast, look at how modern societies would kind of characterize a balanced perspective. We would typically tend to look at a centrist position, right? And that is what most of us would call a balanced view. The human understanding of balance is based on the idea of a center. Even when we use the analogy of tipping the scales, right? We are using it because we judge balance based on where either side is in relation to the fixed center, if that makes sense. The Forkrul's view of balance is the total opposite. They believe that balance exists in the extreme and that you have to be in this endless cycle of enforcing one extreme and then the other, one extreme and then the other, sort of the two opposites, as Ruin said. The ultimate example of their sort of obsession with balance is probably what they did to their own god, right? In the classic case of embracing diametric opposition, they went from worshipping their god to bringing him down and sort of wounding their god. They went from worshipping the god to just using the god as a blunt instrument against the Kachinchamal. The word that many use in the series to describe this is the Forkrul Assail judged their god. And this sense of justice is such a huge departure from anything that we would consider to be justice. Our notions of fairness and justice are based on compromise. Their version of it has no room for compromise. And therefore, in the Malazan world, they are humanity's reckoning, for lack of a better word, for millennia of exploitation. Banisha even says, and I have once again a direct quote from him, I have all these direct quotes today. Banisha says, exploit the world at your peril, dear friends. One day someone will decide to speak for that world. One day someone will come calling. And he says this in direct reference to the Forkrul Assail. So this is what makes them such a great antagonistic force. It makes so much sense for them to be one of the final apocalyptic threats that our protagonists face, because they are these cold and creepy, emotionless things, but their logic is usually beyond question because their thinking is so clear-cut. Their morality is so clear-cut. It's not needlessly convoluted the way that human morality is. And whenever they make a case for why the entire human species has to be shut down, they make such a rational argument that it's hard for you to not admit that it's a pretty airtight case. And even though there are tons of villains in fiction who do this whole thing of claiming to be humanity's reckoning and all that, because of all of these things that I mentioned, the Forkrul Assail felt so fresh and creative. Another interesting question worth asking about them is, are they fundamentalists? Are they fanatics? Are they extremists? Everyone in the Malazan universe seems to think so. Brute calls them the purest manifestation of arrogance. Ruin says they need to be hunted down and just slaughtered. Almost more or less everybody we meet considers them to be pretty single-minded and fanatical in their pursuit of things, right? But we get a little more of this into a great scene in the final book between the two oldest living Forkrul Assail, Sister Reverence and Brother Diligence. And I keep smiling when I think of this scene because it's a funny scene. They're having the serious conversation on strategy. The big siege is about to start. The final book's big siege is about to start. And Brother Diligence has been reading Gothos's Folly for a while. And in the serious, typical Forkrul Assailian conversation on strategy, all of a sudden he quotes Gothos's Folly and he says, in a war between fanatics and skeptics, the fanatics always win. And he's referring to themselves, the Forkrul Assail, and he's quoting from Gothos's Folly. And Sister Reverence doesn't like this at all. And she then makes a very clear distinction between the human understanding of extremism and the Forkrul understanding of it. And she kind of makes the case that they are different from human extremists because the ideal that they fight for is greater than their own interest, that is greater than what they want, and that is for the greater good of the world, blah, 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 which is probably the first chink that we see in their logic, because it's a pretty typical cliche sort of justification that any tyrant would give, essentially to justify their power. And Brother Diligence once again quotes some passage from Gothos's Folly that points this out, and Sister Reverence just gets annoyed and walks away, and she orders him to burn that book. She says, burn that book. That's an order, right? That was a funny scene. Even the sort of the oldest Forkrul Assail was sort of getting corrupted by reading sort of Gothos's Folly. Gothos's Folly deserves a video on its own. I should probably think about that. So the only other chink in their armor that we see in a scene in terms of their logic is another great scene between one of the purebloods and the human commander. So what happens is the Forkrul and their army of mind control soldiers have laid siege to the citadel, and there are a bunch of humans there who are defending it, and the Forkrul Assail, the female pureblood, is so shocked by their determination that she calls for a parley. So she wants to control the human commander, who comes out for the parley and then take control of everyone else. And the human commander comes out alone. And she thinks to herself, what an idiot he is for coming here without bodyguards. And the guy is dumb enough to come out unarmed as well. I mean, come on. He's dumb enough to come out unarmed, and all he has is a sword. And she knows that because she's pure blood and not just water, that no matter how strong this guy is, she can take over his mind and she can get things done. She has a really interesting conversation with this human commander where the Assail points out what an evil, repulsive person the previous king who held the citadel was, and she even points out the way that he would hunt down animals and display their bodies as trophies. So typical human behavior. And the Forkrul Assail says that she had that king's entire family killed and stuffed like trophies just to see if she feels the same pleasure from it. and eventually concludes that she's superior to humans because she doesn't. She found that disgusting. And the fact that she found it disgusting convinced her that she was morally superior to the humans. She makes a really good point, but the human commander then makes some good points as well. And he points out that the Forkrul are now doing to the humans what sort of they accuse the humans of doing to many of the sort of weaker races. And she doesn't really have an answer to this, right? Because ultimately the Forkrul do not have an answer to that question. For all their moral clarity, that is the small chink of, are you now not sort of doing the same things that you judged other people for? And she isn't interested in taking the conversation further. She says, look, this is an interesting conversation, but I'm going to take control of you now, and I'm going to have you take out that knife and kill yourself. I will then walk up there to that citadel, and I will take control of all your troops, and they will now be fighting my wars as mindless slaves, right? So she then uses her mind control power on the human commander, and it doesn't work. She says, what? And she tries to use it on him again, and it doesn't work again. And the guy then takes out a wooden card and says, oh, guess what? I'm Ganos Paran, bitch. I will fuck you up. And he disappears into the card, and the Forkrul can't follow him into the card because she's worried that she might get stuck in an alien realm. And that was just a great scene when it's revealed that the person she was speaking to is Paran. Even though we should see it coming, I still read it at a time when I had forgotten that it was Paran, and that scene and revelation was just great. Anyway, so I guess the point of this video was to show sort of just how interesting the Forkrul Assail are as villains, not only in their aesthetics and their culture and all that, but in their philosophy too. If you wanted to interpret their story as a tragedy, if you were kind of pro Forkrul Assail, I have no idea why you would be, but if you are, Erikson gives us enough meat to interpret their story in a tragic sense as well. Their attempt to use the crippled god's heart was in many ways their last stand. It was their last stand to enforce what they truly believed in, to defend the worldview that they held throughout the evolution of their race, and really the last chance to have some dignity in terms of what they saw happening all over the world and their helplessness to stop this human exploitation of the planet. They were the victims of their own uncompromising nature. I think Ruin even says that their civilization was destined to crumble or to ruin, right? No pun intended. Even with that final faction in Collans, they were on the verge of civil war when we see them, right? Calm and Equity have already judged Reverence for being tainted by wanting to seek power from the crippled god's heart, and Calm is already working on kind of using Icarium as a weapon, and blah, blah, blah. The point is that even if they had won that climactic battle in the end, the faction would have still crumbled with these internal power struggles. Their nature makes their destruction inevitable. So I guess the ultimate lesson from the Forkrul Assail is this: that there will always be a price to pay for true moral clarity, right? We human beings might be hypocrites, but you need to be a hypocrite to survive in this world. You need to twist and bend logic and your own rational views in order to justify what is in your self-interest. Because whatever you might say, right, about the sort of Forkrul Assail, they are not hypocrites, right? They will not bend and twist their logic for the most part to just serve some material need. Look at and whatever you might say about them, you cannot say that they're hypocrites, but look at the price that they ultimately pay for this moral clarity. Look at the price that they ultimately have to pay for refusing to participate in this hypocrisy that the others are. Every other founding race unites against them at the end of the book, because every other founding race realizes that their moral consistency, their moral clarity, their sort of lack of trying to find loopholes in logic in order to justify our own actions, which is what all the other races do. The other races realize that such a clear-cut view on morality will only lead to destruction, right? And ultimately, that's what we need to credit them for: their consistency and their moral clarity. As terrifying as it is for the human reader, it was essential for them to be the sort of antagonists of the story, and for their worldview to be a justifiable worldview in terms of something that can be a huge threat. So I mean, that's it, guys. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope there were some sort of takes there that we can carry the conversation on forward with a lot more. So thank you and see you guys.